you going to give us a green light or should we just go?
You're good.
Okay.
Good? Okay. So I guess we'll get started.
Yeah. So welcome everybody. How are you all doing today?
Good?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us at the very, almost end of the conference. My name is Kristin Marsicano, and I'm an Android developer, instructor, and author at Big Nerd Ranch.
I'm Zack Simon. I am a UX UI designer at Big Nerd Ranch. And so we both work together. We work on a lot of consulting projects together.
That's right. So we're here today to talk to you about closing the loop in collaboration between designers and development, or designers and developers. Our goal is to inspire and empower you to address any adversity you may be having in your own situations dealing with your counterparts. And we're going to do that by telling you our story and about how we've been able to work through some of the trouble spots that we've encountered.
Right. I think what's important here is that we first have to acknowledge that there is some kind of problem.
There is a problem.
There is a problem, and that's the first step in healing. So working with people can be very hard, and working with people that are extremely different from yourself is also very hard. So as designers and developers, we have very different skills and different ways of processing information, and ultimately that can make communication a little bit dicey.
So this underlying difference in styles can manifest itself in lots of different ways. We want to highlight one example that we both lived through. So Zack, why don't you tell us about your design on the left here?
So it's a great design. I've worked very hard on it.
It looks great.
Oh, thank you. So I'm making sure the user experience is just right for the user. I might have tested it and really validated that. I'm making sure it's matching brand standards that maybe the company that I'm doing work for has given me. So ultimately, it's really polished. I've really worked hard on getting all the nuances correct. And so I'll give it to Kristin.
Yes, and I get the design. I'm so excited to start work. And then I look at it, and I'm like, oh, crap. When I see it, it looks great, but I know the stakeholder is expecting when I give them a build that it looks exactly like the design. And when I see the design, all I see is more questions than answers. There's not enough information for me about sizes of things and the font styles and even the colors. And while it's possible for me to probably try to extract this information, I know from my own experience it can take me a long time, and ultimately I usually never get it right. But anyway, I do my best, and what you see on the right on this screen is what my build looks like. So I'm really excited. It's fully feature complete, and I'm sending it over to the stakeholder or sending the build over to the stakeholder. And then Zack catches wind of it.
Right. So the stakeholder will then come to me. And then they ask me why it doesn't look like the design that I gave them, which was on the left. This happens often. And oftentimes I'll get to this point, and it'll be a little disheartening, because I've put a lot of effort into some of the things that might be considered nuanced, like the font sizes and the colors. A lot of this is brand specific, and it's also like an accessibility thing that we want to consider. So whenever it gets to this point and we've delivered something, they're unhappy about it, I'm a little unhappy about it, and Kristin ends up being a little unhappy about it as well.
That's right. No matter how the problem manifests itself, you end up with unhappy people and with a project that's suffering.
Mm-hmm. So we wanted to take you on a little journey.
That's right. We want to take you on a journey through making a sample app, and that app is an app where you're going to be able to complement other people on your team.
Right, which is really sweet, right? That's a nice concept. Yeah, we won't dig too much into the app itself, but just to give you some context. So yeah, at Big Nerd Ranch, we do a lot of consulting work, so it's important to remember that that's our viewpoint. We usually work in an agile fashion. We work with clients, that's a big part of it. And we work in a way that design and development actually have the ability to communicate with each other. Those are really important. For storytelling purposes, we're just going to go through this in chronological order as we would any other project.
Yep.
And along the way, we're going to hit some issues, some points of interest.
It's a real project after all.
Yeah. And so we're going to highlight these that come up probably regularly, and how we get around it and make sure that we're not doing the wrong thing there.
So here's an overview of what one of our projects looks like. Don't worry about the details, we're going to get into those, but the idea is there's a set of things that we always do at the very beginning of a project, but ultimately we get into the sprint loop, which we repeat over and over and over until we successfully complete the project, of course.
Right. Before we get into any really like hardcore app dev work, we're going to start the project off with a kickoff, a project kickoff meeting. Basically here, like I said, it's a meeting, which I know everybody loves. Meetings are just the best. So this meeting is very important, though, because it helps us align on a bunch of different issues, and everyone on the internal project team is going to be there.
That's right, regardless of their developers or designers or project managers. And there's 3 key things that we always address. So who is doing what? This is all where we make very clear the roles and responsibilities and the specifics of what we expect from each other. We talk about what are we doing and when is it going to be done. So things like scheduling our daily stand-up and any other recurring meetings, when scheduling when builds are going to go out and what review things are going to be built into the process. And then finally, how are we going to do these things? So what tools are we using? What documents are we producing? I think a good example of this in Android is with respect to assets. So who is going to be responsible for ultimately creating all the different density buckets? How are we going to exchange the assets? How are we going to ensure that the most up-to-date versions are always in the app?
Right. So we're figuring out all these things, but also we're breaking the ice. We're getting to know each other, getting to know all of our quirks. And that's very important because we're going to be communicating with each other, and knowing these things ahead of time can lead to maybe not making quick judgments about each other later.
Yeah. It helps to remember there's another person on the other side of the design or the build that you're seeing.
Right.
So, all right, so here's the thing. We did the kickoff, right? That's where we're at. We know when we're doing things, what we're doing, and who is doing what. So we're ready to just jump right in, right? I'm going to start developing, and Zach's going to start creating designs.
Probably not. So we've just established that we're making this app to complement each other, and that's all we really know about it. And ideally, before we start the project, we want to learn more about it. There's going to be some things there that are going to be really important to the project success. And so we're going to learn all of these things about the project in a period called discovery. Discovery is where you gather information. So I'm going to be gathering a lot of information regarding the user, any needs that they have, what stakeholder needs I might need to consider, and things like that.
Yep, and I will be trying to get any information about existing implementations, API documentation if there's something we're expected to integrate with, and also trying to suss out if there's any technical risks that we want to try to address in advance if possible.
Right. So by the end of this period, we really want to come out with some action items, some requirements. So basically, a list of everything that we could consider work for the first couple sprints is going to be, that's a reasonable deliverable for all of these. What could also be useful to my client is maybe coming out with an estimate that shows what maybe what this would cost at the end, which is, it's an Agile project, so you can't really know. But most importantly for the two of us is that we'll come out with a user flow map for the project and the way that we're intending it to work. So I say user flows. At BNR, we do something called an app map, where it's a glorified user flow that's mostly centered around how the different features we're imagining would coagulate into the UI. So here we're showing these white rectangles would be more like screens rather than things that the user can do. But on these screens are the list of things that the user can do. So we've also got some decisions in there, and we're showing how the user would flow through these different things. This is the most important part here is that we're also naming the screens here. So we're both using like sign up and login when we talk about these things.
Yeah, and so the idea of a shared language is something we're going to repeat throughout here, but it's something we found has been really important in helping streamline communication with each other and then also with any other stakeholders or managers or whoever else is involved. It's very easy when I start developing to start naming things. It's like, oh, okay, I have login. And so in my code, I call something like sign-in activity. And then I start trickling down in the language I'm using and talking to Zach. I'm talking about signing in, and he's like, well, wait, what do you mean? Do you mean sign up or login, right? Yeah. So we really try to be consistent with language. We name things up front, and Zach is very good about coming up with the names, which as a developer I love because naming is hard. And we use that same language throughout.
Right. So we're going to call it sign in and login, just to let you know. So right. We've gotten this. We can really get started now. We know enough about the project, and we have an idea of where we're going. Yep. So we're just going to launch into Sprint 1.
That's right. So here's an overview of what Sprint 1 looks like.
Right. So imagine this is a loop. And here, basically, in the diagram, this gray line would represent things that we're doing together. while the red line would be things that I'm doing, the blue line are things that Kristin is doing. So we work together throughout the sprint, but we also diverge so we can have time to work on the things that we need to separately. Even then, though, our paths will often intertwine because we like to review each other's work.
That's right. So we always start every sprint with sprint planning. This is ultimately where we plan and commit to the work that we're going to do within that sprint.
Mm-hmm. Right, so we're writing, prioritizing, committing to stories just for the sprint, and we're understanding the dependencies that we might have on each other. So I don't necessarily want to work on something that if it's going to get in your way,
right?
And I want to get out ahead of you.
Yeah, we should be clear that this is a process that we do, or sprint planning, we do it together. So it's not like we're siloed doing it alone.
Right. So for sprint planning, I'm going to work on login. That makes the most sense.
Yes. So the thing is, Zack is going to work on the login designs, but I'm not going to have any designs to work from yet. So one might think, all right, why don't I just go ahead and I'll start implementing my own version of login, and then we'll sort of merge them later, right? Because then I'll kind of have a head start, and we'll have the login screens in place, and we'll be good to go. I'll just make it look like the design later. Does that sound like a good idea?
No, that's not a good idea.
So our rule of thumb here that we do at Big Nerd Ranch is we never implement any user-facing features that don't have design yet. We have learned from experience that ultimately this produces more headache than anything, and it causes churn.
Right.
So the question then is, as a developer, what am I going to do during this first sprint? Right? I could, I guess, sit around and do nothing, but that would be boring. So usually what we do are what we call chores. It's anything that's not reliant on the design. So this can be things like, setting up a base version of your app, making sure that continuous integration is working, that the client can get the builds, and even things like some integration with outside APIs that you're going to have to interact with and make sure they're under test, for instance.
Right.
So we move on from sprint planning. We each know what we're doing.
Going around the wheel.
I'm going to do my chores. What are you going to do, Zack?
And I'm going to be working on login. And my goal here with designing this login feature is that I'm designing it to meet the user's needs, but then I'm also designing it to where by the end of this sprint, Kristin has everything that she needs in order to implement it. And that takes a few different steps. So first I'm going to start with wireframing the login. Basically with wireframing, I'm just identifying the flow of the feature in the context of the UI. So here I'm adding in any functional annotations like what error states and what different states the button should be able to be in, and where the user would go as they're moving through the UI. So this is very important, and it's basically like this, but covered in notes. Right. So this is important also for identifying all the UI components that I'm going to have to create visual design for as well. And once I have finished the wireframe for the flow, I can actually begin doing that. So the way that I'm going to do this is by creating a style guide. And actually, all the designers at Big Nerd Ranch like doing this atomically, which if you don't know about atomic design, Brad Frost has wrote a book about it, and it's really, really great. You can literally have a conference about that one topic, I bet. But anyway, basically with my style guide, I'm going to create atoms, which is the smallest parts of the UI, like color and type and things like that. And then I'm going to use these to build molecules, which are the UI components that we all know and love. And then from these molecules, I can then build them into organisms, which would be the equivalent of our wireframe screens. So the goal here is I'm creating a concise list of styles and consolidating all of them in one place so that we know exactly what they are. With atoms, so like I said, these are the smallest bits of the UI. A type style, for instance, it might be Roboto Bold 20 SP. That's a lot of different variables for one type style. So what I'm doing there is I'm creating I'm taking a lot of information and giving it one name, which in this case would be title. So whenever I talk about title and when Kristin talks about title, we both know exactly what it is. There's some rules established for that. Also, this is the same with color. So I'll be assigning this hex value to the color blue, and I'm going to name it blue. And then if it is one of the theme colors that we'll talk about in a bit, I'm also going to give it that name as well, so that we both know what that color is, and we both know how it fits into the UI.
Yeah.
Once I have all these atoms, I can then begin assembling the molecules into something that looks a little bit closer to the visual design that I want. And so I'm just following like material design standards here, but I'm still grabbing, I'm essentially tying back to the atoms that I've created. So all of the molecules that I'm creating here are just made of the smaller pieces I've already identified. What's really important here is that I'm showing Kristin how I'm doing this. So with my molecules, I'm going to annotate them and show her I'm actually using this type style here, and it's in this color for these different states. Again, the communication part being the most important thing here. It's great if she can see it, but if she knows how I did it, that's even better for her.
And I think what's awesome, I don't know if any of you as developers have been through this before, and maybe I guess from designers it presents challenge as well, but I've been in situations where I'll get comps and I've got like 7 screens and they're all annotated, but they are annotated with like each individual piece of information. So every piece of text has its size and its color and its font. And I try to, I obviously want to create a reusable style, so I'm trying to like extract those by looking across all the screens. So it's awesome that we're actually starting with the design, having this notion of reusable pieces.
Right.
Awesome.
And it's great for me too. As I move into these organisms that I talked about, I'm going to take the wireframes that I had made before, maybe even some functional mock-ups, and tie back to the molecules that I've made. So every step of the way, I'm labeling things by the names that I've given them previously, so that there's very little chance that we're not going to know what we're talking about. So to recap, my organisms are made from the molecules, which are made from the atoms. And in this kind of flow, tools like Zeppelin and Simpli, they're really good for communicating some of the smaller details in this, but the style guide really serves to show how all these things are working together.
Absolutely.
So I've worked on all this design. I've got the functional wireframes. I've got the style guide. Basically, this is all that Kristin needs. And so I'm just going to send it to the stakeholder, right? Does that sound like a great idea?
It sounds like a horrible idea. I've been burned by this before, and it's kind of what we highlighted in the beginning, right? Designs are oftentimes, thrown over to the wall to the developer, and we don't get an opportunity to give input. And while I'm not a designer, I know some things about how long it might take me to do something. So I might end up in a situation if I don't get to look at a design where I'm expected to implement something that's not realistic in the time or budget, or I don't have enough information, etc.
So we build in time for that, basically.
Yes.
That's a part of our process, is that we review each other's work.
That's right. A rule of thumb that the developer always looks at the designer's work before it's passed over.
Right. And while it's this nice, neat little dot here, it actually always looks like this every time. We're basically coming from our 2 different viewpoints. We've got very different priorities, like we said before. And it's going to be this kind of annealing, where we both have different solutions, and we're both going to champion different solutions until we find the one that's going to be right for the project.
That's what compromise looks like.
So once we've done this, we've really ironed it out between the 2 of us. I can then give my designs to the stakeholder for review. And so we've created a united front in that way.
That's right.
And then once we're done with that, we like to do this thing called a sprint retrospect, where as an internal team, we get together and talk about the commitments that we made and whether or not they were reasonable. But also, we talk about our process. Like, did we do a good job doing these things that we said we did? I mean, I think we did.
I think so.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
There was a couple things I want to tweak, but we
right.
can talk about it.
But the idea is that as we go along, we're constantly iterating on our process as well. We're iterating on the project, and we're iterating on the process.
Okay, so currently, let's take a step back and see where we're at. So we finished sprint 1. Oh, and Zack and I are going to switch here. we finished sprint 1. We have the designs ready to go for login. And I've also got, just the base version of the app up and running. And I know that the stakeholder is able to receive the builds and get them up and running. Let's make sure I have this in the right direction. Okay, so here's an overview of what sprint 2 looks like. It looks very similar, right? Right, yeah. But I promise you it is different. The main difference with Sprint 2 is that I now have user-facing features to work on, and so there's going to be some extra steps involved to ensure that the work I'm doing matches the expected result with respect to the design. Okay, so like always, we're going to start with sprint planning. So Zach, what are you going to do?
This sprint, I'm going to work on sign up.
Okay, that sounds
It's probably
good.
going to be a very similar process to the last sprint.
Yes, and so now that I have designs for login, that's what I'm going to work on. And during sprint planning, what I'm going to be doing, and with Zach's help, is write user stories. So all of our development work is driven by these user stories. And the idea here is that we break them down into little chunks that make sense for the developers.
Right. So we want to make sure that these big designs, the things that I've given Kristin, can be broken down into the smaller things that it's going to make more sense for you to do.
But overall, it has to be usable, not just by me, but also by Zack or whatever designer I'm working with, and the stakeholder. So this notion of the shared language and continuing to use the same terminology that we've introduced in the app map and throughout the designs is really important here. Another key rule of thumb is to keep, once we've written these user stories and we've committed to them for the sprint, that we keep any communication about a story as close to that story as possible. So we use something called Pivotal Tracker for our stories. There's different options out there, but the nice thing about that tool is it allows us to actually comment on the story itself. And so when I have a question, for instance, about the user can see the error text when entering an invalid email, I won't message Zack directly about it. Instead, I'll ping him on the story so he can respond there and we can keep it all in one spot. So let's talk about what makes a good user story and how it facilitates collaboration between the two of us and also with our stakeholder. So first of all, we have, this is the app map, and again we have the notion of the shared set of language. So from our login screen, you had mentioned, oh, sorry, I'm one screen behind. Thanks, Zach. Teamwork. So here's our app map. You saw this before. Okay, so we have this shared set of language that we'll continue to use throughout our stories. And if you notice with the login screen, I had shown there was 3 separate stories that map to that one screen. This is usually the case. Like I said, we're breaking it down into stories that make sense for development, so they're little smaller chunks. But we make sure all of these can easily be grouped together into one set of features that map to the app map by using something called epics. But ultimately, we label our stories so that they can all be found based on the login keyword.
Right. I think it's important to note also that the stories that we are writing are usable to everyone. So I can go in and from reading a story, I can understand what's going on there and I can provide input. And that it's not just a purely technical thing, it's something that we can all communicate on.
Exactly, yes. Okay, so really quickly, part of what makes a single story a good story is to make sure that it's very clear what steps have to be taken to get the app into the state where it should be checked against the criteria for that story. So this might be a set of test steps or just overall preconditions. Also important is to have very clear acceptance criteria. So this is like your checklist. So Zack is ultimately going to be looking at my build and being like, okay, for this user story, did they meet this set of criteria? And he'll go through step by step.
Right. And also, I'll even help while she's writing the stories to figure out what this acceptance criteria is, because I have all this context from the wireframes that I've created, and so I can easily just apply it there.
Yes, you're so in it at that point.
So in it.
And a lot of times we'll also include in a story what is not included, to overuse that word, to be very clear and make sure there's no churn on the story. So for instance, with this particular login story, I'm being clear that I'm not including the invalid email or password states, and I'm also not including functionality of clicking buttons. So out of sprint planning, I have my stories for login written.
Right, and we're just, at this point, we're branching off to work on our own things.
That's right. So I'm going to go along my merry way and implement login, but I wanted to demonstrate to you this notion of shared language and how it carries into your code. So the simplest example I can think of is with colors, right? Zack showed you the colors that he created in his style guide, and while it's a little small, the key here is to note the names of things. So Zack named his 2 blues blue and blue dark, and I used those same exact names for my colors. It sounds obvious, but it's a simple thing you can do to make it easier for, number one, if Zack is looking at my code, he can see the mapping, but also when we have new developers jump on the project, or even for my teammates on the project. It's a very clear mapping. Also, Zack he knows, he's awesome. He knows a lot about Android and styling and theming Android, so he had already specified some theme colors for me, and I made sure to set up that same relationship in my colors. I'm sorry, this says colors XML, but in my style XML code. So you can see I'm referencing for color primary dark that should show blue dark. So another simple example of an atom is the type style. So I've called out two here. Zack had specified the title and the body, and so I've mapped that directly to styles, text styles in my styles XML file so that I can refer to it later on from other styles or widgets. So now we step up to a molecule. So we have the edit text that's going to show up on the login screen, and on the bottom, on your bottom right, you see the edit text, the annotated edit text that Zack had produced in our style guide. And in the style guide, he set up that the edit text style references the body type style. So he's used the name body. So I want to make sure, again, that I set up that same exact relationship in my code. So you'll see in my standard edit text style for text appearance, I'm now referencing the body text. So again, it's the same exact relationship he's reflected. So stepping further back to the screen, so our screen now has a bunch of stuff, but here I'm focusing on edit text. And you'll see that in the edit text widget specification, I'm referencing the standard edit text style. And I've got it here in two places, so I actually took a look, and it seemed to me like we were using this same standard edit text style for all of the edit texts that I've seen in the design so far. So I thought this might be something I could specify at the theme level. But instead of just doing that, I Slack messaged Zack, because this is not just a story-specific thing, it's more an overarching, and I said, hey, this standard edit text style, should this be the default for everything?
Right, and so we'll go back and forth on that and make sure that my style guide is reflective of what she's actually got in the code.
Yeah, so he said yes, every edit text should be that by default. So I went ahead and updated my app theme so that every edit text will get this style by default, which allowed me to clean up my code. And Zack also, like he said, updated the style guide so that we are always in sync with what's going on. So here's the thing. I have a build. I'm so excited. I followed the style guide to a T. Like, it looks awesome, right? I think it looks great. So I'm going to send it directly to the stakeholder, right, Zack? What do you all think?
No, we're not going to do that. I want to look at her build. So in our process, we also build in design QA. So I'm not like hardcore QAing, like trying to find every bug and stuff. I'm just looking and making sure it matches the design that we had agreed on. And at the same time, in this process, she's going to be reviewing my design work. So that's how we're kind of interweaving our path.
And it looks like the annealing again. It's not usually like, oh yes, Kristin, your build was perfect, no matter how hard you try. There's usually something that needs to be tweaked. Okay, so once we get our build and our stakeholder reviewed, or our build and our design QA'd by each other, we pass it off to the stakeholder.
Right, and then we'll do basically the same process, stakeholder review, and then we'll retro on the sprint again to see what we can be doing better. So to sum up everything that we've done, we've basically talked a lot about this process. We've gone through this process where there are certain checks involved to make sure that Kristin and I are on the same page. And also we're sharing a single source of truth in all of our documentation. And so we've done this far. Everything's great. We're going to continue doing this onward after Sprint 2. And everything is just going to be perfect forever, right? Like nothing could go wrong.
If only it were that easy.
Right.
So ultimately, we've thought about tools and processes, but we haven't talked about another key factor, which is
the people.
The people, right? So here's the thing, just like we invested time in tools and documentation and process, you need to invest time in how the people relate to those tools and documentation and processes. So what we've learned, number one, is that the team has to believe in the process. They have to buy into it. They have to understand it. That's what the project kickoff is, for the most part, for, right? It's getting everyone on board, making sure they understand what's going on, giving them opportunity and time to ask questions and to help change the process if necessary. And it's also what retrospectives are for in part, right? They help everyone give feedback in real time and help adjust and have ownership in the process.
Right. So it's up to the whole team to really own the success of the project wholeheartedly.
Yeah,
it's
wholeheartedly.
like you really have to, it has to be like, you have to go project first before your own personal goals at all times.
So here's the thing, all right, we've got tools, documentation, and process, and the whole team is on board with it. But what happens when the process fails us? Dun, 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 right?
No, no.
Or what happens if individual communication gets difficult? Let's say for some reason, one particular day, I feel like, the feedback I'm getting from Zack is harsh, and I'm just struggling with it, and I'm just really just not feeling good about it, right?
She's just mad at me.
I'm just mad at Zack. Or what if, something outside of our control goes wrong? The stakeholder changes, or they're trying to push in more requirements, and it's adding pressure, and we're really stressed out of a deadline. So what happens when adversity shows up?
Well, it's all about us as individuals. There are certain things that we could be doing as people to just be better people. So it's very important that we're making sure that while we're buying into the process, we're being good teammates and stuff, that there are certain basic human things that we're also doing as well.
That's right. We've basically learned that when it comes to adversity, you can be a great team and have all this stuff, but it's all about how the individual handles it. And our rule of thumb here is to be responsive, not reactive. Sounds so easy when you say it, right? But being reactive means that you're just doing your sort of knee-jerk reaction, right? You're not thinking it through. It's usually based on emotion and usually ends up in more harm than good, right?
There's no project where it's so fast that you have to be reactive.
Yes.
Like, you can always take time to be responsible.
That's right. So being responsive means stepping back, thinking about the facts, really trying to think about the long and short-term outcome of your actions, and acting from that place instead of just your gut reaction. So we said, it's hard to do in practice, but there's 3 key things that we have learned that we can focus on as individuals when we get into tough situations that help us be more responsive.
Right. So being empathetic is really important. You need to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes to see what's going on in their life. And you're never going to know. There's always going to be some things, like something's happening outside of work that's making one of your coworkers less than reasonable. And so you want to make sure that, like, if you're being empathetic, and you don't necessarily need to know the details about their life in that regard, but you could also understand that there might be something.
Yes. So number 2, check your ego. So this isn't to say don't take pride in your work, but it's more focus your pride on the overall success of the project, right? Checking your ego means when you're getting feedback, really trying to accept it wholeheartedly and understand that it's not directed like at you as a person, but ultimately it's about making the project better.
Yeah, and finally, assuming positive intent in others is really, really great, and everyone should be doing it. I need to be able to trust Kristin in order to work with her. So I'm going to assume that everything that she's doing is for the success of the project, and she should do the same for me. There's no way that I could know. I don't know Java. I don't know what Kristin is doing most of the time, but I assume that she's doing it right and that she's not trying to wrong anyone. So.
Yes, absolutely. And another key thing with this too is keeping the trust, is to always direct any sort of feedback or any sort of adverse situation with one of your teammates directly with that person if you can, rather than like going around to the other teammates or to their manager or whatever. But that requires trust.
Right. So if you're keeping people at the center of this process and documentation that makes your projects really smooth, then you can really help close the loop between design and development.
That's right.
Right.
So that's all we have on that today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to hear more from us, please check out one of our books. My favorite one is The Android, not that I'm biased. Or consider attending one of our week-long boot camps. Or please follow Zack or myself for Big Nerd Ranch on Twitter. And I'm horrible with this clicker thing.
Oh, you finished it.
I finished it.
Yeah, so.
Well, we're here. I have cards and stickers, so you can come up and talk to us in person and get our Twitter handles if you want to follow us if you don't already.
Right. But yeah, super happy to be here. Thank you all for coming.
Yes,
we really
thank you all
appreciate
so
it.
much.
How are we on time? Oh, we're good. We have a lot of time. Does anybody have questions? Yes.
So as design keeps evolving, how do you guys communicate that to each other?
These style guides and these wireframes and things like that, they're living throughout the project. So I'll use InVision a lot. So I'll keep everything in InVision. That way she can easily go and find it, and I can tell her, like, well, right now we're at this version in the style guide. I still need to update this one thing. Yeah. And it's got a great commenting tool, so you can go in and like comment on it and keep the conversation there as well.
Yeah. I think the key is too that we really are like we're in stand-ups together every morning. So if something changed, like the stakeholder pushback, and oh no, we got to tweak this one thing, like I'm constantly hearing about that, and then vice versa. Like if there's something on development that affects Zack, like he's hearing about it on a daily basis.
So with respect to getting a little technical about Android, how well do you, Zack, know like the Android sort of vocabulary of like things that it can do in terms of like programmatic drawing instead of just like producing assets in like bitmaps and vector drawables and all this kind of good stuff? How far are you guys along that curve?
So we've.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, good. Yes.
Sure.
Thanks for
Bill actually might know.
Well,
but
the question was how much does Zack know? I'll try to summarize it. How much does Zack know about like the Android framework specifically with respect to designing and drawables and?
right.
Yeah, in general, sort of technical vocabulary.
Yes.
Very little.
You know a lot more than you give yourself credit for.
So at BNR, I'm an Android designer, but I also design for mobile web and iOS and things like that too. So our team generally sticks to the vocabulary that HIG and stuff like that provides. But because we work so closely with development, like it's not uncommon for us to say like I know your theme.xml and like I learned this from this project, from working on this, but you don't need to be a technical person to be able to communicate about a lot of these things. If that's kind of like the
one tiny example, like so for instance, if you have a background which is like a noisy moire kind of pattern thing, that might be really hard to do on
Right.
Android, but it might look really nice and there might be another way to do the same thing that becomes a lot easier. Do you go back and forth?
Yes, that's exactly the back and forth we were talking about, where it's like, he knows he knows stuff about Android, but I know more, and so it's, he'll present something, and I will have the opportunity to go back and say just what you said. Like, that looks awesome, but like, it's not that easy to do on Android, and sometimes I won't even know how to do it. I'm like, let me see if I can find out how I would do it, depending on what it is, and like, what would be a reasonable,
right. So
way to do
on
it.
the communicating constraints is really important to us because I'm gonna guess the best, but I really rely on Kristin to give me that kind of technical detail that helps me make good decisions.
Although I will say the more we go through these, like the more and more apps we do together, the more you start to see patterns of things people are asking for. So we definitely, I think we get more efficient over time at going back on some of those newer, fancier things.
You talked about developing small, actionable user stories from the wireframes, but you were talking about that when you were inside the sprint. How do you align that to a traditional Agile where those stories aren't actionable, like they have to be actionable before the sprint starts in order to be in that work?
Yeah, so we, the question was about like with sprint planning and we're writing user stories when we're in that sprint. So when we stagger it, so sprint planning, even though it's shown in sprint 2, actually happens before sprint 2.
Yeah. So sprint retro and sprint planning usually happen in this weird gray area between the sprints, but we won't start working on the sprint until we actually know what we're committing to for it. So.
And we're usually, honestly, when we're story writing, like writing at least 2 sprints worth, like we're always trying to say at least 2 or 3 sprint stories worth ahead. So even in that discovery period, we're usually starting to try to like flesh out some stories, which is have to be careful about because we don't necessarily have designs. But the planning is always happening, and that's also from development perspective why we start with like a bunch of chores to give time to like prime the pump with designs that we can then flow stories from.
What's the length of your sprints?
It depends on the project.
Yeah.
We've seen a lot of success in like 2 iteration sprints, so like 2-week sprints.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I've always been on
it can
2-week
vary.
ones, but we've had, I know some recently that were 1 week.
So it allows that time to communicate.
Yeah.
I guess.
Have you ever had a client force you to use Waterfall?
Have you
Oh,
ever
yeah.
had a client force us to use Waterfall?
Does everything just break down, or do you guys deal with it?
No, it's a lot of the same process actually. So on a more like waterfall project, we'll still work pretty agile internally. So we still consider like sprints and things like that, even though there might be a big waterfall like here's your app thing, big delivery.
For us, I guess, they wanted all of the designs first, and then all of the dev work after, and it was just terrible.
I wish
Yeah.
I had a dry
So-
erase marker. So when I think of projects like that, like, so we have this notion of we'll start like, design will start at like 100% and you'll have a developer on at like 10% or 25%, whatever makes sense. So as designs are being produced, like the developer still has opportunity to give input. And so I guess sometimes even unofficially we would do that even if the client wasn't asking for that, just because we know it's going to save us time in the end. And then it's like as the project moves on and we get to the point where there's designs ready, then design will trickle off and maybe they'll be down at like 25% or 10%, whatever works, and development is on full time. So then we still always build in, like Zach said, maybe unofficially, that we've always got some counterpart
Right.
helping us out.
So, but to your point, to the projects where maybe design is handed over or thrown over a fence to development, we find a lot of issue with that too, because sometimes companies will come to us and they'll bring us design, and then we just need to be able to develop them. And so there's a lot of lost context there, and sometimes we'll end up having to have a designer on to support and try to be the go-between between the designs and the developers. So, but yeah, that ends up working out, but that is pretty difficult, and it's generally we find it has been a little harmful to having really successful builds that match the design. But I'm just gonna keep going.
How do you handle traditional QA?
Oh, that's a pretty good question.
This
We
is-
didn't really cover
how-
that in here.
How do we handle traditional QA? So do you want to touch on that, or do you want me to say something?
Sure. So usually with QA, if we don't have an in-house QA team, so we'll often get either whatever client that we have to provide some QA, and then we make sure that we're just building it into our process.
Yeah, I think so. There was like that point between where like we each review each other's work, and then we give it to the stakeholder. The stakeholder might be the next step might be their QA team.
So it's at the end of the sprint.
Yes, yes, yeah. There was some.
Yeah, that was me. So most of my experience is that stakeholder is a dot that's like over the entire process. How have you mitigated that when you've contracted out to specific companies?
That's a good one.
So the question or comment was that the stakeholder really a lot of times is like overarching the whole thing, not just one little dot. And how do we deal with that?
So actually, stakeholder communication is throughout. So they'll also, like, while I'll also be in Pivotal Tracker helping Kristin out with stories, they'll be in there accepting them and seeing the conversations and chiming in. We usually try to have an internal or a product owner on their side be a part of that close-knit process so that they're always there and they're always providing feedback, but they also understand why we have this process and why we communicate in the way that we do, so they don't get, all up in it.
So follow-up question.
Mhm.
So, and I think it may be relevant to what he asked. How do you make that stakeholder understand your process and make them understand that?
We have a whole education process that goes on through the sales pipeline, and then we also include them. We have a similar sort of kickoff that we do internally with the client, our client or stakeholder, whoever it is for you all, to get them on board with it. But really, to be honest, I mean, most of our clients, it does take constant reminding or just reminding of the process or reminding them of what's happening when. Of course, always taking feedback, but just ensuring them that we do it this way for a reason. We're never closing them out and saying, oh, we can't take that information right now. But we always just try to streamline it into what we're doing.
And then we'll also adapt our process.
Yeah.
If they have a need that we need to meet in our process,
Yeah.
we'll work with them. Oh, that's all right.
So it sounds like you're creating the user stories only based on the actual work to implement the feature. Or do you keep track of the design work?
It depends. Sometimes we'll keep it in Pivotal as well. We'll just have a different label for design stories. Sometimes we'll just use a different tracker entirely, like Trello or something. InVision actually has one built in now, which is very similar to Trello, where the screens that you're designing and adding to InVision, you can actually move them to different statuses, like done or being reviewed or something like that. So,
Have you ever tried to merge them together?
yeah, we've had we'll have a design or a story that is for both, and then before it can be worked on, we'll just have a label that it needs design or something like that. And so.
Do you explicitly version your design? And
So
You
the
versioning
question was
designs?
versioning designs. Usually, yeah. We want to make sure that we've got like a good history of all the major changes that have happened throughout. Versioning design is like a whole different tricky topic, but yeah, generally, and
never
mostly it's
stop.
around those big. Yeah, we never stop. We usually focus those around big changes, like adding in new screens or maybe like a pivot or something like that.
And do you use some sort of a versioning system?
We used to use Layer Vault a little bit. Now we name our files. So version 1, version 2.
What's the team size?
Sorry, say it again. Oh, what's the team size?
Oh.
It depends, honestly, on the project. The last project I was on was 3 developers and 1 designer.
It's only Android or?
Oh no, we do Android and iOS. So we do have some projects that span like Android, iOS, and web.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a whole probably a whole nother talk on how we keep everybody in sync and
Yeah.
goes a little
Three
bit.
Android developers in the project, though, right?
Yeah, there was 3 Android developers. Yeah.
So usually the ratio between design and development is 1 designer per platform, and so there could be multiple developers per platform. So.
But we usually also then we'll have like a project lead, so Zack isn't expected to like keep up with always direct communication with everybody, although like I said, like we have a Slack channel per project, so we're all in it, so inevitably there's just like communication always flowing.
You do the cycle, the sprint, all the team together, or like that?
Oh yeah, we'll do them all together. We're just all working on separate things. Yeah. Cool.
Anything else? Well, thank you
Yeah.
all so much for
Thank you for
joining.
coming. This is great.